This is cassette 1, track 1, Notes on Blindness. July the 5th, 1984. What happens to the brain when optic stimulation ceases? I am concerned to understand blindness. The pictures in the gallery of my mind have dimmed somewhat, so I could no longer remember easily what my wife looked like or what my daughter Imogen looked like.
I began to be terribly afraid that I would lose you.
Everything was drifting away. How could this happen to me? Who had the right to deprive me of the sight of my children at Christmas time? Now I find that there's been a strange kind of change in the state of my brain. There is something so totally purging about blindness that one either is destroyed or renewed. I think I am beginning to understand what it's like to be blind.
Welcome. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much. Yeah, we're really good. Thank you so much for having
How are
us.
you guys doing today? Excited about this conversation? Yeah. It's a beautiful film. Congratulations, guys. It's you know, it seems almost impossible to make a film about blindness. You know, it's one of those things where you have to respect, what's going on with the subject and make it sort of understandable to the viewer. I mean, tell me how you came upon the story and how you guys sort of heard about the story of James Hull.
Sure.
John.
Well, we actually came to the story through John Hull's book. It's a book called Touching the Rock. It was published in the 90s, but it reads like a diary that spans 3 years, that really charts the progression from John going through a process where he lost his sight in his middle age. Shortly after, he'd remarried, and shortly after the birth of his first son, actually, he lost his sight very rapidly. And he was a theologian at the University of Birmingham in England, and he felt that if he didn't learn to understand blindness, he felt that it would destroy him. So he began using tape recorders to document his life. He began keeping an audio diary. And these series of recordings would analyze what initially he felt like he was losing in the loss of vision. So they deconstruct, what it means to lose smiles, what it means to lose eye contact, or for precious memories of your wife and children to be kind of fading. But over time, it actually becomes an account of discovery and eventually one of rebirth and renewal. Because across this 3-year period, John undergoes a kind of change in his whole sort of conscious experience of the world. And by the end of the 3-year period, he's actually reconceived blindness entirely and comes to actually view it as a gift. And that's all captured on these original audio tapes. And so we read John's book, and in the foreword it mentions that it's transcribed from these tapes. And we asked John if they still existed, and one day he sent them to us. There was 6 of these cassettes, which contained about 16 hours of recordings. And that was about 5-6 years ago now, and that was kind of our starting point, and it all went from there.
Yeah. And Peter, I mean, when you have this sort of treasure trove of source material, I mean, how do you go about building that narrative? What are the elements that you want to touch upon? How do you make those cuts? I'm sure it's very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That was really the kind of the central kind of creative challenge of the project, was how to kind of whittle down this material and try and make a kind of coherent narrative, I suppose. And what James didn't mention is along the way there was other sources, other bits of archive that kept coming to light. So even just about 6 or 7 months before we were due to start shooting, we went up to Birmingham, which is where John and Marilyn lived, and we're mostly based in London. And we were asking them to to try and find some correspondence that John might have had with his parents who lived out in Australia. And we turned up, and they'd unearthed this box of cassettes, this additional box of about 16, 17 hours worth of additional material, and in there was a fantastic kind of trove of other recordings. So there was the voices of the children. Anyone who's seen the film will know that John's daughter is quite a kind of key figure. She was the only person who'd known her father when he was sighted, and also after he lost his sight. The only one of his children, sorry. And she made these fantastic recordings, her own little kind of mock radio shows and mock kind of news reports and interviews and so forth. And there's hours and hours of these recordings, the family recordings, on special occasions, on birthdays, on Christmases. John would set up kind of recorders around the house. And so, as this stuff was kind of coming to light, in many respects, it kind of amplified that problem that you speak towards. But it was a process that took several years, and we would carry an audio edit around with us, and we'd be constantly kind of excavating, I suppose, from this material and trying to make the story, to the point where when we came to shoot, we had a kind of a 90-minute audio cut of the film, in effect, to work from. But,
yeah, and obviously, there's a little sensitive material in there. There's an actual person's life, and you're talking about an actual person's family and what the struggles that they went through. How are you communicating with the family? Are you keeping them pretty in the loop as far as how the editing process is going and how, they're going to be shown on screen?
Sure. Well, it was very much a collaboration with John and his wife Marilyn. The process really was that for the first kind of year or so, we were trying to make sense of this vast audio diary archive that he'd kept. But every few months or so, we'd be going up to Birmingham. We live in London, so we'd be making the trip up to Birmingham, spending time with John and Marilyn, interviewing them about this time. And actually, their reflections, looking back from a distance of 30 years, looking back on those early 1980s period, form a kind of narrational layer in the film. And so you have John and Marilyn looking back on that period. And so, yeah, it very much was a collaborative process. Unfortunately, John actually passed away as we were shooting the visuals for the film, which was deeply sad and really changed the project because of that collaborative aspect of it. Because we really expected for him to be kind of with us here presenting the film. We actually made a series of short films in the run-up to the feature, and he would use those short films in his speaking events and really took ownership of them. So yeah. But Marilyn and a lot of the family have been with us when we've been touring the film. Yeah. But maybe we should also say something about the kind of stylistic approach, actually, because John and Marilyn aren't portrayed on screen. So early on, we were kind of presented with the challenge of having this rich audio archive, but one that's set 30 years in the past, and also one that kind of is a very internal journey that goes into John's dreaming life, into his memories, and into his kind of imaginative world, as well as being a kind of document of sensation as well, because John talks about new dimensions opening up in experiences of sound and kind of auditory experience. So there's this huge challenge of how to kind of portray that on screen. And so there's a decision that we made early on that all of the voices in the film would be the authentic voices of John, his wife Marilyn, and the family, from John's audio diaries and also from the home recordings that Pete mentioned. But on screen, they'd be played by actors. So we cast wonderful actors, Dan Skinner and Simone Kirby, to play John and Marilyn. And they're actually using this technique of lip-syncing along to the original recordings. And that meant that we could kind of follow John on this journey into this internal world of blindness.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's moving. It's very effective in the film. And then I think another question I think most of us have is we take sight for granted. We're walking around, we're viewing things, we're reading reactions on people's faces. Was part of it what drew you to the project, Peter? I mean, maybe understanding what's going through something like this would be, and do you feel like, for the both of you, do you feel like you came out understanding more about what the process of losing sight is and what sight means to being a human being in this earth?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, having the opportunity to spend so much time with John, I mean, he is an incredible individual and incredibly articulate, and the way he was able to deconstruct the kind of sight loss experience was in his written work and in the diaries was endlessly fascinating. People like Oliver Sacks had written quite extensively about him, and indeed, like his work is held in quite high regard within sort of literature of blindness, the first-person testimonies of blindness, and it is all about that. It's about showing us something about the role of sight, actually, and much of the early reviews to the book, you know, was saying actually it's not necessarily a film about blindness, but about sight, and it teaches us about how we live in the world. So yeah,
I think that's one of the key aspects of John's account, is that in the early years of sight loss, because he was going through this process of grieving and mourning that visual experience, he really set about kind of deconstructing how the visual plays in our kind of memories, in our dreaming life, in our sense of identity. But it's an account that kind of looks both ways. It looks back to the visual life that he's leaving behind, but also towards the blind identity that he comes to discover.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because of his position as a learner and a teacher, he's able to sort of eloquently put what this process was like. And, you know, there are some moments that I think his understanding of self is so powerful. You know, when someone takes him aside in a restaurant and tells him that, you know, his sight is a matter of will. You know, they say that he can basically hypnotize him into seeing again. I mean, to be able to absorb that interaction and look into it the way that he did. I mean, how was your interpretation of how he dealt with these things and his own personal dealing with, you know, the blindness?
I think John's whole approach in terms of keeping the diary as a therapeutic process was one of kind of harnessing the sense of isolation and the sense of panic that he felt. I mean, actually, there were some times of quite acute panic because John has also suffered from quite severe asthma, and he'd have these moments of panic where he felt incredibly trapped and isolated and unable to kind of, you know, be a part of the world. And John's approach in all of these instances was to kind of analyze and to say, you know, to take each aspect, everything that frightened him, he'd kind of try and deconstruct and fixate it. And that became an empowering process for him. And as we say, over time, those things that initially he found frightening and the things that he found bewildering, increasingly they ceased to matter. He said that the things that initially one, you know, mourns the loss of and tries desperately to compensate for, you know, became unimportant.
And it seems like, you know, keeping these audio tapes were completely therapeutic to him as well. I mean, when you were speaking with John, Peter, I mean, what was his sort of understanding of what this relationship with the audio recording was? You know, was it a necessary tool for him? Was it something that if he stopped, maybe it would have been a harder process for him?
Yeah, I mean, so the first couple of years after losing sight, so he had, in 1981, John had a series, had problems with his sight throughout his entire life. In fact, he lost sight in one of his eyes when he was 17. But up until the age of 45, actually, had you know, relatively functioning sight. But he had a quite dramatic collapse of his vision in 1981, June 1981, just as James said, a couple of weeks before the birth of his first son. So, and then over the next sort of 16 months or so, that sight gradually kind of slipped away. He lost all light sensation. And initially, John was kind of confronted by the sort of the practical challenges of how to approach blindness. He was a theologian, an academic, and a father, and had these responsibilities and needed to carry on, you know, functioning, I suppose. And so he set about with sort of great kind of spirit, what he called sort of conquering those practical challenges of blindness. It was only after that period, and after he felt like he could, you know, he knew how to get to work, he knew how to, you know, cross a road, he knew how to kind of communicate with strangers. It's only after that period that he felt this sort of deepening sense of kind of crisis, and he knew then that he needed to actually confront the blindness itself, and he knew that he needed to understand it. And so what began as this sort of almost kind of cathartic process, I suppose, of analysing the blind experience, the day-to-day experience, he said it was a way of kind of shielding those closest to him, by which he really meant sort of Marilyn, his wife, and his family from that pain. Now, he had no intention of sharing that that diary in the early years. It was only a couple of years later when a friend mentioned to him that this may well have some kind of wider scope and of interest to other people, that the project then sort of refocused, and I think he began to begin thinking about it as a written work.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking to that, now you guys have been screening it around festivals, and it's coming out this week in the Film Forum here in New York City. What has been the reaction from audiences, maybe perhaps people who have been touched by the disease, or have a family member that are dealing with it? Has it been helpful for them, perhaps?
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, sight loss is such a varied experience. It's far from a kind of binary experience. In fact, I think something like 93% of people who are registered blind in the UK have some form of light sensation. So John's experience of having no light perception actually is just one experience of many experiences of sight loss. And so, the reactions have kind of been varied, and everyone's brought their individual kind of experience to bear on it, which has been tremendously rewarding. I think one of the things that John mentioned in his in the foreword to his book is that he would never want to kind of speak for anyone else. That his was an individual experience, an individual process, and I think it does. His account becomes one that's about how to be a father, how to be a husband, how to kind of live and exist in the world, as much as it is about the kind of physical process of sight loss. It's it's very much an emotional journey as well, I think.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that, in the UK, we released in the UK on the 1st of July in cinemas, and we worked very closely with the Royal National Institute for the Blind, one of the big sort of leading blindness charities in Europe, trying to look at different ways blind and partially sighted audiences can experience cinema, and this led us to develop a number of different accessible materials for the film, and in effect actually released the film with kind of 4 different soundtracks. Both a couple of audio description tracks, which is perhaps the most common way that blind partially sighted audiences experience film at the moment, which is a kind of an external narrator who kind of comments on the action and describes the scene through the film. But we also released something we called enhanced soundtrack, working with some of the leading practitioners and researchers at Roehampton University and with our sound designer Joachim Sundström, to try and tell the story just through sound. So rather than having an external narrator, we actually built in more narration from John and Marilyn in the film, and additional music and additional sound design, and mixed that in 5.1 for cinemas and was exhibited in cinemas. And as well, we were also partnered with an app which allowed to put this technology in people's mobile phones. So rather than being reliant on cinemas, you could download the soundtracks in advance and listen to it, regardless of actually if you're watching in a cinema or on TV or on video on demand or what have you. And so we were trying to start a conversation really about different ways in which people, blind audiences can experience the film. And we're trying to do the same in the US, I suppose. We have got some screenings of this enhanced one in cinemas over the next few months. If anyone's interested in learning more, please do get in touch, because it is very much just the beginning of this process. We're definitely looking for responses from the community.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, as the cut as it stands, I also really love the way you guys use black, you guys use blur. I mean, it's, I highly recommend you guys see it in a cinema, because there's something about having that darkness and being able to hear John's voice narrating. And so how was that process, the technical aspect of that, choosing when to go completely dark and how long to hold that, and how that would get the point across, and how that helped you as filmmakers?
Sure. I think obviously approaching this kind of subject matter in cinema and in visual terms is kind of is a kind of paradoxical project in some ways, and we kind of set about, with our cinematographer Jerry Floyd, setting kind of several limitations about what we felt like the camera and the lighting could and couldn't do. And they were very much instinctive and very much led by John's account. John talks about how often he'll lose his sense of spatial geography. Suddenly someone who he thought was talking to right in front of him, the voice might suddenly come from there. as things move, you kind of are less able to track them in space. So we felt like using wider establishing shots that would give the audience a clean sense of the space would feel really inappropriate. So we tended to shoot on tighter, longer lenses, and so that you'd kind of lose your sense of the space. And similarly, I think, with the kind of lighting as well, John talks about, in the early days of his blindness, a sense that he had a very sort of detailed sense of his immediate field of awareness. So he'd be very conscious of the things that were close to him, but as you moved further away, that sense might drop off unless they're emitting sound. So we tried to use shadow to kind of delineate those kind of fields of awareness. But also we were conscious that, as we say, that those were experiences that I guess John progressed beyond as his whole thinking around blindness and his whole sense of being and stability in the world kind of developed too.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also a VR component out there in addition to these enhanced versions. Can you speak a little bit about that? That's something that's being shown around on Oculus and. Yeah.
So we were very fortunate a couple of years ago through one of our funders in Europe, Arte France, to be teamed up. They were looking for projects which both had a film and also some kind of interactive component. And they teamed us up with some guys in Paris, a guy called Arnaud Collinard and Amory Leboeuf. And they began developing this project kind of in tandem really to the film. Which particularly focused on some of John's sort of observations on the development of his kind of sensory awareness. And there's several passages in the film which in John's diaries, which we were particularly drawn to, and we're also conscious that perhaps film itself wasn't necessarily the best kind of creative expression of them. So. There's a chapter, for example, where John is a passage where he's sitting in the park and he's describing the sounds, the environment, the sort of panorama of sound around him, the sound of his children's footsteps playing nearby, and the rustling of a newspaper on a guy on a bench next to him. And another passage where he'll talk about how weather can transform the environment, how the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves in the trees can give shape and dimension to the world, how thunder puts a roof over his head. All these fascinating ideas and concepts that we thought really lent itself to some kind of some kind of non-film experiment, I suppose. And we were very lucky in that in the last couple of years, VR has really caught a bit of the zeitgeist, and there was some support available. So we began developing this project, and this led to our VR project, which was played at Sundance with the Sundance Film Festival. So the film and the VR were programmed together, which I think is the first time that the festival had ever done that with a project. And then subsequently, the VR has been touring around the world alongside the film. It is available for free, actually, for download from the Oculus mobile store, from Google Play, and on iOS as well. And it's here in New York. If anyone knows of the VR cinema, Jump Into the Light, it's playing here this week. So yeah, it's been a fascinating experience, and one we very much see as a kind of complementary piece to the film.
That's great. Well, people should definitely check that out. I guess there's some questions in the audience, so we'll start off right there.
Hi, nice to meet you guys. So I was wondering, how much research did you do outside of his own stuff that you had, and what did you take away from the film personally?
Thank you for that question. Well, we're fortunate there are lots of wonderful first-person accounts of blindness alongside John's, and also lots of kind of comparative studies. Like, so there's a neurologist called Oliver Sacks who wrote a really fascinating comparison between different accounts in a book called The Mind's Eye. It's fascinating to see how varied, as you would expect, every account of blindness is. And of course, as we said, because every experience of sight loss is highly individual, and depending on, whether you might have been blind from birth or lost your sight gradually. So, for example, part of John's process when he became blind was very much a rejection of the nostalgia of the visual world. He says he didn't want to. So after he was kind of clinging on to these precious visual memories of his wife and his children, he felt that actually that was kind of a form of self-delusion in a sense, and that he was clinging on to memories that now were several years old. And so part of his process was to actually to reject that and to say that he would try and leave behind that visual experience and not live in that nostalgic world. And then over this 3-year period, he says that eventually he felt that he did move into a world beyond sight, and increasingly he would have to remind himself that that his children had appearances, and those things were no longer important to him. But by contrast, other accounts of blindness that we've come across, there's one by a guy called Zoltan Tori who talks about how he has this extremely colorful, vivid, rich, internal visual world. So yeah, it's fascinating to see the different responses. And then in terms of what we kind of got from the process of making the film, you know, we were very lucky, I think, to spend so much time with John and Marilyn. They're very wonderful people. I remember when we asked John at one point to kind of look back on this period and look back actually on that diary entry about visual memories and talk about what that meant to him now. And he said that that period of mourning was now so far behind that those things had ceased to matter. And he said that ultimately he felt that being human is not seeing, it's loving. And I think that's certainly a message that we've kind of taken from the film.
That's great. Next question right there.
Hello, thank you for coming. I was wondering, because you guys were talking about the paradoxical nature of making a film on blindness. Same could be said about, you know, just reading literature. Did you guys move away yourselves from like reading any of his memoirs or his book once you got the audio tapes? Like, did you strictly put yourself in a position of being an auditory learner?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think as I think when working on a subject of this nature about an individual, I think you've got to in a sense work with the materials that you have available to you and in front of us. And for us, we always felt a very strong kind of grounding to the audio tapes. But those audio diaries that he kept were in effect a kind of a first draft, I suppose, for that book, for his book Touching the Rock. And then we always had him, John, there for the development period to draw upon, and he was a kind of constant well of inspiration. Really, we'd regularly go up and spend time with him and talk with him and try and tease out different areas of his life story, really that we thought may well be of interest. And they were incredibly welcoming and generous with their time in that respect. So yeah,
that's great. And one last question right there.
Hi, how are you? I was wondering, what do you think your initial attraction to John's story was?
Thank you for the question. It's quite difficult to pinpoint because I think we actually came to John's book kind of by accident through another project. We were researching a project about the experience, about reflections on snowfall, actually. And in John's book, there's one diary entry that's about snow. Snow is often called the blind man's fog because it kind of dulls the sort of contours of the environment, so it dulls the pavements and the road that you might navigate with your cane, and also dampens the kind of acoustic environment, so it makes it harder to kind of locate yourself by sound. And so we met John and kind of came across him through this very strange entry point. But I think as we alluded to earlier, like John's process and the process that he goes on across this period, I think it is a grieving process, and I think I think we've kind of taken a lot from it that is comparable to other aspects of life. I think that John and Marilyn came in the later years when we talked about them to talk about this idea of interpreting loss as change, and as soon as you do that, what was previously frightening is no longer so, and that's a very empowering thought, I think. Yeah.
Nice. Well, check out Notes on Blindness in theaters, guys, and definitely try to check out that VR experience. One more hand for James and Peter, guys.
Oh, thank you so much.